I love drawing and painting building facades, especially houses and little shops. I love this kind of art because it presents a great challenge when it comes to both the drawing and the painting aspects of the art making process. And I also really love that this type of art provides a great opportunity to practice bringing more of yourself into your pieces. Practice making more artistic choices on what to simplify, what to remove, what to bring in, what to change. And I have created traditional line and wash tutorials as well as pen and ink tutorials, but I had never challenged myself to create a facade piece using primarily watercolor pencils. As I am sharing this footage, I'm also going to be talking about my 10 best tips or the key findings that I'm going to be taking with me to future watercolor pencil building facade pieces. So let's jump in. Tip number 1 is to choose your paper wisely. For this one, I chose to use hot press watercolor paper instead of the cold press that I usually use for traditional watercolor paintings because watercolor pencils are a drawing medium that, yes, turn into a painting, but you're applying that pigment with a pencil. And when you're applying that pigment or that color with a pointy tip and the paper is rough or has a lot of texture to it, it won't be applied evenly because that tip is going to skip over that tooth or texture of that paper. And because the pigment is not applied evenly, that is going to lead to more texture at the end. Of course, if you like high levels of texture, then that's perfectly fine. You can use cold pressed, and there are brands out there where their cold pressed paper is not as textured as others. Tip number 2 is to create your pencil sketch lightly before starting with the watercolor pencils. Remember that your sketch is the foundation for everything that is coming up next. By creating your pencil sketch lightly, you're going to ensure that you won't be able to see your pencil work at the end of the painting process. Watercolor pencils have that watercolor characteristic where the color is more translucent or more transparent. So if your pencil work is quite dark, you're gonna be able to see it through a lot of that color work at the end. Not only this, but if you are pressing down too hard when you're creating your drawing, you might scratch or damage your watercolor paper and you're not going to be able to fix that. Tip number 3 is to make sure that your form and perspective look sound in your sketch before moving on to applying any sort of color on it. These drawing fundamentals really come into play when you're drawing things like buildings and man-made objects. There are flat planes and oftentimes symmetry that we need to make happen. Houses and buildings are compound structures made up of multiple three-dimensional forms. In many of my drawing tutorials, I talk about how it is important to learn to simplify whatever it is that you're trying to draw into simple shapes or forms. This is why it is so important to learn to draw things like cubes, rectangular prisms, triangular prisms, cylinders, etc. Because if you know how to draw those simple three-dimensional forms, you're going to be able to draw compound structures like this one way more easily. I have many tutorials on form and perspective for beginners, so don't worry. I'm going to make sure to link to some of those down below in the recommended resources, though there is definitely room for imperfection, little accidents, wobbly lines, and these imperfections can 100% be a part of your piece and can add an interesting, unique look and personality to the piece. You still want to make sure that that structure looks three-dimensional and sound. Tip number 4 is to make sure that architectural elements such as windows, columns, doors are aligned whenever they need to be. In other tutorials, I have provided tools and techniques that I personally use, such as plumb lines and laying down long horizontal lines when I am drawing things like windows. You don't want your windows and your doors to look crooked or misaligned or like they're different sizes when they should look the same size, because that's going to lead to messy results that are not very realistic. Tip number 5 is to simplify things and don't be afraid to change things either. As you're creating your pencil sketch, or even before you start with your pencil sketch, make sure that you observe the reference photo and ask yourself, what do I want to change? Is this shadow or little element here actually contributing something to the composition? Or is it just confusing the viewer or taking away or distracting? If you have things like brick textures or other kinds of textures or high levels of detail and very classic style architectural elements, how are you going to simplify those so that you're able to both draw and paint them and arrive at looser, kind of easy results, glowing results that are more expressive, if that's your thing, of course. What do you like about the building or the photo as a whole? What do you want to keep? And what don't you like? What do you want to change and remove? In this one, for example, even though I liked the facade itself, I thought it was cute, this is more of a winter scene. There is snow on parts of the awning and the steps and on the ground, and that is something that I wanted to change. I wanted my piece to look more colorful and lively, more like the springtime or summertime. So I took out the snow and I decided to bring in extra greenery, plants to make the piece more lively and colorful. I also turned this into a bookstore. I added the store name and I changed those little things that you're able to see through the window. Tip number 6 is to use a limited amount of colors. Don't continue bringing in random colors out of whim from whatever watercolor pencil set you're using, and make sure that you are repeating colors as you're moving forward so that you can end up with harmonious, well-integrated, cohesive results. I used a total of 10 watercolor pencils for this piece. I opened up my watercolor pencil set, I set it beside me, and then I started outlining the different parts of my drawing where I thought I would be using that color. By outlining these different areas or elements with the colors that I was thinking of bringing in for those areas or elements, this allowed me to visualize what the piece would look like with that color combination before I committed to those specific colors. And what's cool about watercolor pencils is that as long as you haven't activated that pigment with water and a brush, you can go in and erase that pigment out, at least a good amount of it, with a soft graphite eraser. And you can also change colors slightly if you do a little bit of layering, so there's no issue there. But I thought that that initial outlining of everything really helped me choose my colors. And there are many ways that you can repeat colors throughout the piece. For this one, for example, I used purple as one of my main colors in this color scheme. I use that in that little roof where the sign is, but I also use that same purple, overlap that purple over other colors to darken and deepen shadow areas all throughout the piece. And this really helps create cohesive, well-integrated results. Blue is another color that I like using for shadow areas as well. But even just repeating colors in different areas or elements will also help lead to more integrated results. And one tip for you if you want to arrive at more colorful, interesting, expressive results is avoid bringing in black. For my watercolor pencil pieces, I really enjoy bringing in, as I said, purple, blue as alternative or wild card colors in my pieces. Or even a dark brown, I would say, is preferable over black, which can definitely lead to starker, heavier results and can also mute out and desaturate other bright colors if you're looking for that bright, colorful outcome. Tip number 7 is to bring in the bright paper as part of the piece. And this can be done in many different ways. Watercolor pencils are like watercolor in that they are translucent and transparent, and we can use this characteristic to arrive at light, glowing results, which is so particular to watercolor as a medium. And we're using the bright paper under that pigment and that translucency to create these light, glowing results. So before jumping in, ask yourself, how are you going to be incorporating that paper as part of the piece? Are you going to be leaving areas of paper uncovered by pigment so that that paper can be left alone and shining through and creating those light values or those whites? Or are you going to do something like what I did with this one, where I created a vignette style edge to the piece where I didn't paint all the way up to the edges of my masking tape. I actually left some paper alone and unpainted. Moving on to tip number 8, and this one is to make sure that you're prioritizing creating a wide range of values or tones as you're doing your layering of pigment. When working with this medium, we're not bringing in white paint. As I mentioned in the previous tip, we're bringing in the bright paper to help us develop those lighter values. And so essentially, the way that you develop a wide range of values is by doing more layering of pigment or covering up more paper in darker value areas and leaving more paper uncovered or doing less layering in lighter value areas. And your midtones are somewhere in between. And there is no need to overthink it, because as long as you're working in layers and you're coming back to see everything as a whole to make sure that your lights and shadows are making sense, you're going to end up with believable results. So after each layer, continue coming back to see everything as a whole and ask yourself if you need to push the contrast in some areas, maybe do more layering in deeper, darker shadow areas to really convey that sense of depth and 3D-ness. And that is going to amplify and increase that range of values in order to make your piece look more realistic. There is no need to continue layering on more pigment and covering up more of that paper in lighter value areas. I created this piece in 3 layers, and just like when I am working with traditional watercolor paint, I always make my way from lights to darks. Moving on to tip number 9, and this one is to make sure that you're allowing each layer to dry completely before applying more pigment on top. If you get impatient and start applying pigment, especially if the tip of your pencil is very, very pointy and sharp, you can start damaging your paper. So for this one, I applied pigment 3 times. And every time I went in to activate my pigment with water and a paintbrush, I made sure to allow everything to dry completely before coming in and applying more pigment. And as I moved through my layering process in my second and third layers, I was only applying pigment in darker midtone and darkest dark areas that I was looking to push that contrast in. So when I brought in my paintbrush and water, I was only activating that pigment in those smaller areas that I just placed more pigment on. I have entire watercolor pencil tutorials where I take you step by step through my layering process, which I'll make sure to link to down below in case you would like to follow along with my layering process. And finally, tip number 10, and this is something that I learned the hard way by ruining some great watercolor pencil pieces. And this one is to bring in traditional watercolor paint and paintbrushes to paint in background areas or larger areas in general. For this one, I decided to paint the ground area underneath the stairs and also the brick wall with traditional watercolor paint. I simply created paint mixtures that resembled my watercolor pencil colors and painted those areas in with those color mixtures. It's easier to paint large areas with traditional paint than it is with watercolor pencils because, again, watercolor pencils initially are a drawing medium. We apply our pigment with a drawing medium, with a pencil. Whereas when you're using traditional watercolor, you load up that paintbrush with a good amount of juicy paint and you can go in and paint large areas fast. This way, you don't have to worry about filling in large areas with a pencil, and also you don't have to worry about arriving at undesired textures or too much of a sketchy look where you don't necessarily want it. And that is it for my tips on watercolor pencil building facades. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. And I look forward to creating more tutorials on watercolor pencils in the near future, as well as more building facade tutorials. Thanks so much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.